Hi guys, this week we're going to be talking about Stuart Hall and representation theory. So we've already talked about Stuart Hall once. He did reception theory, remember that? Preferred, negotiated, oppositional. Well, cough, he's the only one we look at who has two theories. So we're going to be learning both of his theories. And the second one is representation theory, and it's this. We've spoken a little bit about it in class already, so I will just break it down a little more for you. So, Stuart Hall's representation theory comes in three main parts. The first part is that the media uses stereotypes, the use of stereotypes. I had a problem saying that line then, sorry about that. So part one is the use of stereotypes. Part two is the fact that it reduces people to simplified cliches. And part three is that there's an inequality of power. So we will go through those three parts and I will explain them. The use of stereotypes. Okay, so Stuart Hall believes the media uses stereotypes a lot. Stereotypes can work as a shortcut for producers and audience, as we assume a lot about the character based on our shared cultural map. So a villain in EastEnders may be dressed a typical way or act in a particular way. Uh, they would be a particular stereotype. So a very simple example would be this guy here. He's a villain in EastEnders. His name was Nick Cotton. And he acts a particular way, a sort of villainous way. I mean, look at the way he's dressed, look at his hair, look at his expression. So he's sort of playing on a stereotype of a bad guy. And this can be useful when you're telling stories because you don't want to have to explain everything. Um, you want the audience to sort of make assumptions about people and sort of go, oh right, that's who he is. So when it comes to stuff like EastEnders, maybe using stereotypes isn't a problem. When it's fictional things, maybe it's not a problem. Or maybe it is. Let's have a look. So, obviously, stereotypes can be very useful when telling stories, but think of the negative impact. So, I think I just said that really. So, here we go. Here's an interesting one. Think about the stereotypes about gender, the stereotypical housewife we have here. So, here are some images from the 50s, the 70s, and there's good old Marge Simpson. But this is the very stereotypical housewife role. And you've got to think how this can be limiting to women and how it could be limiting to the role of a housewife, and how it sort of expects not only sort of duties of the housewife, but also things like maybe types of character, types of way, very caring, very motherly, very all these different things, these assumptions about the person that could be made. But also think how that can be used in other ways. So stereotypes about Muslims, for instance, in the media a few years ago, we had a lot of stereotypes coming up and a lot of representations coming up in the media a few years ago that sort of framed Muslim people as terrorists, often had pictures of extremists with guns, stuff like that. So we had a repetition of that stereotype, and it changed a lot of people's minds. It made a lot of people think that's what all Muslims were like, and obviously not. It's just an extreme minority. Think about today, if you look in the media now, how Trump supporters are being stereotyped. Now, I'm not saying that some Trump supporters aren't like this, but they're not all like this. Clearly, there are some people who vote for Trump who aren't gun-toting maniacs. Actually, I have a couple of friends in America who voted for Trump, and the first time round, and I couldn't really understand why. They seemed exactly, very similar to me in all different ways, but obviously they opted for him. But if you look at some of these representations, the sort of crazy Trump supporter, gun-toting, pro-American, all this sort of thing, that's kind of reductive, and there are obviously a variety of people. Keep an eye out for these sort of things as you look at the media as we go forward from here. So, and the next part of that is that Stuart Hall believes that stereotypes reduce people to a very simplistic cliche, um, and this is often very damaging. Obviously, people are more complicated and shouldn't be reduced to a simple set of characteristics or assumptions. This can be damaging when it moves from the media to our understanding of the real world. So, while it might be kind of useful to have the stereotype of the villain used in EastEnders, some of those images that I showed you of the housewife or the terrorists or even the Trump supporters could be quite damaging if that sort of starts to um, become what people think people are like in the real world. Um, Obviously, people are very complicated and shouldn't be reduced to a simple set of characteristics or assumptions. This can be damaging when it moves into the real world and our understanding of real world issues. Actually, already read that paragraph, not to worry. You get a double dose of that. Um, Even seemingly positive stereotypes are negative. So there's a kind of very common Chinese stereotype that all Chinese people are very academic and very good at science and maths and sort of academic subjects, and they're very studious. And that seems like a very positive thing to say. Like, oh, Chinese people are very clever. Chinese people are very, very studious, very academic. You often see Chinese people or Asian people represented in the media as being a sort of IT wizards and stuff like that. Um, that doesn't seem negative. It's saying that a group of people are particularly clever. However, what is it not saying? So by saying they're very sort of academic and very scientific, it sort of in a way makes them a little bit cold, a little bit less humane, maybe more clinical in certain ways. Um, yeah, and actually, if you follow that thought through, about maybe 7 years ago or so, there was a story that came out in America that was very lurid, that I won't go into details about, that was about how Chinese, how the Chinese only want to motivate their children to do very, very well, and how they thought in school, and how all the focus is put on how they do academically at the cost of um, other things, shall we say. So yeah, it can be very, very damaging. So we can have a look at a couple of examples of that. We've sort of spoken about this before with ethnicity, but if we look at these sort of black stereotypes of strength, we see a lot of times the black man is represented as an athlete or a body or a sort of physical strength. Now that's not necessarily, you might not think that's a negative thing to say, but actually what's it excluding in that stereotype? So if all black men are physically strong and slightly aggressive, then are they not thinkers? Are they not academics? Are they not lawyers and doctors and things like this? Are they always seen as, strong physically? And you've got to wonder where that stereotype might come from. And maybe it comes from, colonial stereotypes of black people working. So all stereotypes, even saying, black people are incredibly strong, that is, that seems positive possibly, but it's not. It has roots and it excludes certain things. So it can be more complicated, just in the same way as saying, oh, Chinese people are very academic. It's a stereotype, and it can exclude other things. So think how this could tie into George Gerbner's cultivation theory that we spoke of last week. You've got a picture here of Stuart Hall and Gerbner meeting each other for the first time. They seem to be getting along. But if you have stereotypes of people that are repeated and repeated and repeated in the media, so we mix a bit of representation theory from Stuart Hall with a bit of cultivation theory, what we get is we get this sort of almost brainwashing effect where the audience will think this type of person is exactly like they're being portrayed in the media. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Which brings us on to the final point. The final point is about the inequality of power and how this affects stereotyping. Stuart Hall believes stereotyping occurs when there is an inequality of power, or subordinate or excluded groups are constructed as different or other. This is through ethnocentrism. So what ethnocentrism is basically judging another culture on your set of beliefs. So it sort of separates them, it others them, it makes them different to you. So if you think about it, really there are a lot of, we get a lot of foreign stereotypes. The French are like this, the Italian are like this, the Americans are like this. Do we stereotype ourselves in quite that way? Do we say, oh, as English people, we stereotypically do this? I don't know, maybe we do a bit, but I'm sure other countries will do that a lot more. think who is in control of these stereotypes. Think who's in control of the media. I mean, generally speaking, is very rich white men. So if they're the ones creating the stereotypes, what do the people who are being stereotyped think of that? If, for instance, if you see a lot of representations of black people as criminals, as you did in movies in, say, the 70s and 80s, um, who is that being done by? Who's writing those scripts? Who's directing those films? Who's the producers of the films? They're not going to be, the people who are being represented as the criminals. So it's worth thinking about that. The social group that is being spoken about is often excluded from the conversation. They're not allowed to define themselves, but are defined by the people in control of the narrative. So I mean that happens today. If you're to, I'm just about to say this in the final paragraph out here actually, but think of who's being stereotyped negatively at the moment. So if you were to look in the press, what is being said about, say, Trump supporters? What is being said about people who voted to remain in Brexit or people who voted to leave Brexit? Words like Ramonas, people who wanted to stay in Brexit but now angry. How are these stereotypes being used? And if they're sort of slightly negative stereotypes, then it can't be that group who's doing the stereotyping. So look at who's being stereotyped at the moment in the media. This would imply that they are not part of the discussion and they are being represented by people who are in control of that story. So it's an interesting thing to look at. Let's move on and conclude. So just to sum this all up and bring it to a conclusion, Stuart Hall believes that the media uses stereotypes, and while they can be a useful shortcut, they reduce people to simplified representations. Even when it may seem these stereotypes are harmless and innocent, they are inaccurate and can be harmful. Stereotypes are created by the powerful and often display an imbalance of power across the people who are being stereotyped. So that's it basically. I mean, how we are going to use this is you are just going to look for the use of stereotypes in the texts that we study. So far we've looked at water aid, and as you can see, there's maybe they sort of try and break a few stereotypes there. Maybe some of the problems were some of the stereotypes that were being used in previous charity ads. And again, we're going to be looking at formation in the next week or so. Actually, we've already sort of began to look at formation a little in some classes. Think about some of the stereotypes that are being addressed in formation. Sometimes I think that in formation she leans into some stereotypes, and other times she sort of readdresses them. Maybe. It's kind of interesting. We will look at that. And finally, I want you to turn to the worksheets as normal and complete the tasks. So along with this video, as always, there will be a worksheet for you. Just work through the tasks and upload to Teams in the usual manner. And thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in class. But just before I go, this guy on the right here is Chris Eubank. He was a boxer in the 90s. UK middleweight champion, and he sort of attempted in a way to sort of break his sort of stereotype a little bit by wanting to act in a very sort of very English sort of upper class sort of gent type way. So you can see the way he's dressed here in the suit. He walked with a walking cane. He sometimes wore a monocle. He wore top hats. Interesting. He bought himself a title as Lord of Brighton, which is where I'm from. He actually lived quite close to me. So he was the Lord of Brighton, drove around in a big truck and a kind of, I think he had I'm not too sure what car he had, maybe a Rolls Royce at one point, but he certainly had a big truck, huge, great big truck. And went around with monocles, jodhpurs, walking cane, cravat, all this sort of very sort of almost dressing like the royal family. He spoke in a weird sort of way as well, and when interviewed by Louis Theroux, he said that he wanted to most emulate Prince Charles because he loved the Englishness of Prince Charles. So it's interesting. I mean, he was trying to, I guess, break free of the stereotype of the typical middleweight boxer. I should say though, he was kind of largely ridiculed for this in the media. He was often the sort of punchline to a lot of jokes, punchline boxer, I suppose that works. He was often the punchline to a lot of jokes, and part of it was because of his image, I think, and the fact that he was so desperately trying to shake from this stereotype that he often came across sort of comically. He was comical at times as well, so that didn't help. Anyway, I thought I'd leave you that image. Thanks a lot, and hope you find the worksheets fairly easy. And see you in class. Take care.